When he finished his coffee, he took his paper and started up the street. To home? What home? Across the street in her backyard, he saw Ida Kaufman, who was wearing shorts and a halter and was hanging her daughter's underwear on the clothesline. Epstein looked around and saw only the Gentiles walking to church. Ida saw him and smiled. Growing angry, he stepped off the curb and, passionately, began to jaywalk. At noon in the Epstein house, those present heard a siren go off. Sheila looked up from the post and listened. She looked at her watch. Noon? I'm 15 minutes slow. This lousy watch. My father's present. Goldie Epstein was leafing through the ads in the travel section of the New York Times, which Marvin had gone out to buy for her. She looked at her watch. I'm 14 minutes slow. Also, she said to her daughter, a watch from him. The wail grew louder. God, Sheila said, it sounds like the end of the world. And Marvin, who had been polishing his guitar with his red handkerchief, immediately broke into song, a high-pitched, shut-eyed Negro tune about the end of the world. Quiet, Sheila said. She cocked her ear. But it's Sunday. The sirens are Saturday. Goldie shot off the couch. It's a real air raid. Oi, that's all we need. It's the police, Sheila said, and fiery-eyed she raced to the front door, for she was politically opposed to police. It's coming up the street. An ambulance. She raced out the door, followed by Marvin, whose guitar still hung around his neck. Goldie trailed behind, her feet slapping against her slippers. On the street, she suddenly turned back to the house to make sure the door was shut against daytime burglars, bugs, and dust. When she turned again, she had not far to run. The ambulance had pulled up across the street in Kaufman's driveway. Already a crowd had gathered, neighbors in bathrobes, housecoats, carrying the comic sections with them, and 2 churchgoers, shickses in white hats. Goldie could not make her way to the front where her daughter and Marvin stood, but even from the rear of the crowd she could see a young doctor leap from the ambulance and race up to the porch, his stethoscope wiggling in his back pocket as he took 2 steps at a time. Mrs. Katz arrived. A squat, red-faced woman whose stomach seemed to start at her knees. She tugged at Goldie's arm. Goldie, more trouble here. I don't know, Pearl. All that racket, it sounded like an atomic bomb. When it's that, you'll know, Pearl Katz said. She surveyed the crowd, then looked at the house. Poor woman, she said, remembering that only 3 months before, on a windy March morning, an ambulance had arrived to take Mrs. Kaufman's husband to the nursing home, from which he never returned. Troubles, troubles. Mrs. Katz was shaking her head, a pot of sympathy. Everybody has their little bundle, believe me. I'll bet she had a nervous breakdown. That's not a good thing. Gallstones, you have them out and they're out. But a nervous breakdown, it's very bad. You think maybe it's the daughter who's sick? The daughter isn't home, Goldie said. She's away with my nephew, Michael. Mrs. Katz saw that no one had emerged from the house yet. She had time to gather a little information. He's who, Goldie? The son of the brother-in-law that Lou doesn't talk to? That's his father? Yes, Saul in Detroit. But she broke off, for the front door had opened, though still no one could be seen. A voice at the front of the crowd was commanding. A little room here. Please, a little room, damn it. It was Sheila. A little room. Marvin, help me. I can't put down my guitar. I can't find a place. Get them back, Sheila said. But my instrument. The doctor and his helper were now wiggling and tilting the stretcher through the front door. Behind them stood Mrs. Kaufman, a man's white shirt tucked into her shorts. Her eyes peered out of 2 red holes. She wore no makeup, Mrs. Katz noted. It must be the girl, said Pearl Katz, up on her toes. Goldie, can you see? Who is it? It's the girl. The girl's away. Stay back, Sheila commanded. Marvin, for crying out loud, help! The young doctor and his attendant held the stretcher steady as they walked sideways down the front steps. Mrs. Katz jumped up and down. "Who is it?" "I can't see," Goldie said. "I can't—" She pushed up on her toes, out of her slippers. "Oh, God, my God!" And she was racing forward, screaming, "Lou! Lou!" "Mama, stay back!" Sheila found herself fighting off her mother. The stretcher was sliding into the ambulance now. "Sheila, let me go! It's your father!" She pointed to the ambulance, whose red eyes spun slowly on top. For a moment, Goldie looked back to the steps. Ida Kaufman stood there yet, her fingers fidgeting at the buttons of the shirt. Then Goldie broke for the ambulance, her daughter beside her, propelling her by her elbows. "Who are you?" the doctor said. He took a step towards them to stop their forward motion, for it seemed as if they intended to dive right into the ambulance on top of his patient. "The wife!" Sheila shouted. The doctor pointed to the porch. "Look, lady—" "I'm the wife!" Goldie cried. "Me!" The doctor looked at her. "Get in." Goldie wheezed as Sheila and the doctor helped her into the ambulance, and she let out a gigantic gasp when she saw the white face sticking up from the gray blanket. His eyes were closed, his skin grayer than his hair. The doctor pushed Sheila aside, climbed in, and then the ambulance was moving, the sirens screaming. Sheila ran after the ambulance a moment, hammering on the door, but then she turned the other way and was headed back through the crowd and up the stairs to Ida Kaufman's house. Goldie turned to the doctor. "He's dead?" "No, he had a heart attack." She smacked her face. "He'll be all right," the doctor said. "But a heart attack? Never in his life!" "A man 60, 65, it happens." The doctor snapped the answers back while he held Epstein's wrist. "He's only 59. "Some only," the doctor said. The ambulance zoomed through a red light and made a sharp right turn that threw Goldie to the floor. She sat there and spoke. "But how does a healthy man—" "Lady, don't ask questions. A grown man can't act like a boy." She put her hands over her eyes as Epstein opened his. "He's awake now," the doctor said. "Maybe he wants to hold your hand or something." Goldie crawled to his side and looked at him. "Lou, you're all right? Does anything hurt?" He did not answer. "He knows it's me?" The doctor shrugged his shoulders. "Tell him." "It's me, Lou." "It's your wife, Lou," the doctor said. Epstein blinked his eyes. "He knows," the doctor said. "He'll be all right. All he's got to do is live a normal life. Normal for 60. You hear the doctor, Lou? All you got to do is live a normal life." Epstein opened his mouth. His tongue hung over his teeth like a dead snake. "Don't you talk," the wife said. "Don't you worry about anything, not even the business. That'll work out. Our Sheila will marry Marvin, and that'll be that. You won't have to sell, Lou. It'll be in the family. You can retire, rest, and Marvin can take over. He's a smart boy, Marvin. A mensch." Lou rolled his eyes in his head. "Don't try to talk. I'll take care. You'll be better soon, and we can go someplace. We can go to Saratoga, to the mineral baths if you want. We'll just go, you and me." Suddenly she gripped his hand. "Lou, you'll live normal, won't you? Won't you?" She was crying. "'Cause what'll happen, Lou, is you'll kill yourself. You'll keep this up, and that'll be the end." "All right," the young doctor said. "You take it easy now. We don't want two patients on our hands." The ambulance was pulling down and around into the side entrance of the hospital, and the doctor knelt at the back door. "I don't know why I'm crying." Goldie wiped her eyes. "He'll be all right? You say so? I believe you. You're a doctor." And as the young man swung open the door with a big red cross painted on the back, she asked softly, "Doctor, you have something that will cure what else he's got? This rash?" She pointed. The doctor looked at her. Then he lifted for a moment the blanket that covered Epstein's nakedness. "Doctor, it's bad?" Goldie's eyes and nose were running. An irritation, the doctor said. She grabbed his wrist. You can clean it up? So it'll never come back, the doctor said, and hopped out of the ambulance.
You can't tell a man by the song he sings.
It was in a freshman high school class called Occupations that 15 years ago I first met the ex-con, Alberto Pellegutti. The first week, my new classmates and I were given a battery of tests designed to reveal our skills, deficiencies, tendencies, and psyches. At the end of the week, Mr. Russo, the occupations teacher, would add the skills, subtract the deficiencies, and tell us what jobs best suited our talents. It was all mysterious but scientific. I remember we first took a preference test. Which would you prefer to do, this, that, or the other thing? Albie Pellegutti sat one seat behind me and to my left. And while this first day of high school, I strolled happily through the test, examining ancient fossils here, defending criminals there, Albie, like the inside of Vesuvius, rose, fell, pitched, tossed, and swelled in his chair. When he finally made a decision, he made it. You could hear his pencil drive the X into the column opposite the activity in which he thought it wisest to prefer to engage. His agony reinforced the legend that had preceded him. He was 17, had just left Jamesburg Reformatory. This was his third high school, his third freshman year. But now I heard another X driven home. He decided to go straight. Halfway through the hour, Mr. Russo left the room. "I'm going for a drink," he said. Russo was forever at pains to let us know what a square shooter he was, and that, unlike other teachers we might have had, he would not go out the front door of the classroom to sneak around to the back door and observe how responsible we were. And sure enough, when he returned after going for a drink, his lips were wet. When he came back from the men's room, you could smell the soap on his hands. "Take your time, boys," he said, and the door swung shut behind him. His black wing-tipped shoes beat down the marble corridor, and 5 thick fingers dug into my shoulder. I turned around. It was Pellegutti. "What?" I said. "Number 26, Pellegutti said. "What's the answer?" I gave him the truth. Anything. Pellegutti rose halfway over his desk and glared at me. He was a hippopotamus, big, black, and smelly. His short sleeves squeezed tight around his monstrous arms as though they were taking his own blood pressure, which at that moment was skybound. "What's the answer?" Menaced, I flipped back 3 pages in my question booklet and reread number 26. Which would you prefer to do? 1. Attend a World Trade Convention. 2. Pick cherries. 3. Stay with and read to a sick friend. 4. Tinker with automobile engines. I looked blank-faced to Albie and shrugged my shoulders. It doesn't matter. There's no right answer. Anything. He almost rocketed out of his seat. "Don't give me that crap. What's the answer?" Strange heads popped up all over the room. Thin-eyed glances, hissing lips, shaming grins, and I realized that any minute Russo, wet-lipped, might come back, and my first day in high school I would be caught cheating. I looked again at number 26, then back to Albie, and then propelled, as I always was towards him, by anger, pity, fear, love, vengeance, and an instinct for irony that was, at the time, delicate as a mallet, I whispered, "Stay and read to a sick friend." The volcano subsided, and Albie and I had met. We became friends. He remained at my elbow throughout the testing, then throughout lunch, then after school. I learned that Albie, as a youth, had done all the things I, under direction, had not. He'd eaten hamburgers in strange diners. He'd gone out after cold showers, wet-haired, into winter weather. He had been cruel to animals. He had trafficked with whores. He'd stolen, he'd been caught, and he had paid. But now he told me as I unwrapped my lunch in the candy store across from school, "Now I'm through crapping around. I'm getting an education. I'm gonna..." And I think he picked up the figure from a movie musical he'd seen the previous afternoon while the rest of us were in English class. "I'm gonna put my best foot forward." The following week, when Russo read the results of the testing, it appeared that Albie's feet were not only moving forward, but finding strange, wonderful paths. Russo sat at his desk, piles of tests stacked before him like ammunition, charts and diagrams mounted huge on either side, and delivered our destinies. Albie and I were going to be lawyers. Of all that Albie confessed to me that first week, one fact in particular fastened on my brain. I soon forgot the town in Sicily where he was born, the occupation of his father. He either made ice or delivered it. The year and model of the cars he'd stolen. I did not forget, though, that Albie had apparently been the star of the Jamesburg Reformatory baseball team. When I was selected by the gym teacher, Mr. Hopper, to captain one of my gym class's softball teams, we played softball until the World Series was over, then switched to touch football. I knew that I had to get Pellegudi on my side. With those arms, he could hit the ball a mile. The day teams were to be selected, Albie shuffled back and forth at my side. While in the locker room, I changed into my gym uniform. Jockstrap, khaki-colored shorts, T-shirt, sweat socks, and sneakers. Albie had already changed. Beneath his khaki gym shorts, he did not wear a support, but retained his lavender undershorts. They hung down 3 inches below the outer shorts and looked like a long, fancy hem. Instead of a T-shirt, he wore a sleeveless undershirt, and beneath his high tar-black sneakers, he wore thin black silk socks with slender arrows embroidered up the sides. Naked, he might, like some centuries-dead ancestor, have tossed lions to their death in the Colosseum. The outfit, though I didn't tell him, detracted from his dignity. As we left the locker room and padded through the dark basement corridor and up into the sunny September playing field, he talked continually. "I didn't play sports when I was a kid, but I played at Jamesburg, and baseball came to me like nothing." I nodded my head. "What do you think of Pete Reza?" he asked. "He's a pretty good man," I said. "What do you think of Tommy Henrik?" "I don't know," I answered. "He's dependable, I guess." As a Dodger fan, I preferred Reza to the Yankees' Henrik, and besides, my tastes have always been a bit Baroque. And Reza, who repeatedly bounced off outfield walls to save the day for Brooklyn, had won a special trophy in the Cooperstown of my heart. "Yeah," Albie said, "I like all them Yankees." I didn't have a chance to ask Albie what he meant by that, for Mr. Hopper, bronzed, smiling, erect, was flipping a coin. I looked up, saw the glint in the sun, and I was calling heads. It landed tails, and the other captain had first choice. My heart flopped over when he looked at Albie's arms, but calmed when he passed on and chose first a tall, lean first baseman type. Immediately I said, "I'll take Pellegudi." You don't very often see smiles like the one that crossed Albie Pellegudi's face that moment. You would think I had paroled him from a life sentence. The game began. I played shortstop, left-handed, and batted second. Albie was in center field and, at his wish, batted fourth. Their first man grounded out, me to the first baseman. The next batter hit a high, lofty fly ball to center field. The moment I saw Albie move after it, I knew Tommy Henrik and Pete Reza were only names to him. All he knew about baseball he'd boned up on the night before. While the ball hung in the air, Albie jumped up and down beneath it, his arms raised upward directly above his head. His wrists were glued together, and his two hands flapped open and closed like a butterfly's wings, begging the ball toward them. "Come on," he was screaming to the sky. "Come on, you bastard!" And his legs bicycle-pumped up and down, up and down. I hope the moment of my death does not take as long as it did for that damn ball to drop. It hung. It hung, Albie cavorting beneath like a holy roller. And then it landed, smack into Albie's chest. The runner was rounding second and heading for third while Albie twirled all around, looking, his arms down now, stretched out as though he were playing Ring Around a Rosie with two invisible children. "Behind you, Pelagudi!" I screamed. He stopped moving. "What?" he called back to me. I ran halfway out to center field. "Behind you! Relay it!" And then as the runner rounded third, I had to stand there defining relay to him. At the end of the first half of the first inning, we came to bat behind 8-0. 8 home runs, all relayed in too late by Pelagudi. Out of a masochistic delight, I must describe Albie at the plate. First, he faced the pitcher. Then, when he swung at the ball, and he did at every one, it was not to the side, but down as though he were driving a peg into the ground. Don't ask if he was right-handed or left-handed. I don't know. While we changed out of our gym uniforms, I was silent. I boiled as I watched Pelagudi from the corner of my eye. He kicked off those crazy black sneakers and pulled his pink gaucho shirt on over his undershirt. There was still a red spot above the U-front of the undershirt where the first fly ball had hit him. Without removing his gym shorts, he stuck his feet into his gray trousers. I watched as he hoisted the trousers over the red splotches where ground balls had banged off his shins, past the red splotches where pitched balls had smacked his kneecaps and thighs. Finally, I spoke. "Damn you, Pelagudi! You wouldn't know Pete Reeser if you fell over him." He was stuffing his sneakers into his locker. He didn't answer. I was talking to his mountainous pink shirt back. "Where do you come off telling me you played for that prison team?" He mumbled something. "What?" I said. "I did," he grumbled. "Bullshit," I said. He turned and black-eyed glared at me. "I did." "That must have been some team," I said. We did not speak as we left the locker room. As we passed the gym office on our way up to occupations, Mr. Hopper looked up from his desk and winked at me. Then he motioned his head at Pelagudi to indicate that he knew I'd picked a lemon, but how could I have expected a bum like Pelagudi to be an all-American boy in the first place? Then Mr. Hopper turned his sun-lamped head back to his desk. "Now," I said to Pelagudi as we turned at the second-floor landing, "now I'm stuck with you for the rest of the term." He shuffled ahead of me without answering. His ox-like behind should have had a tail on it to flick the flies away. It infuriated me. "You goddamn liar," I said. He spun around as fast as an ox can. "You ain't stuck with nobody." We were at the top of the landing, headed into the locker-lined corridor. The kids who were piling up the stairs behind stopped, listened. "No, you ain't, you snot-ass." And I saw 5 hairy knuckles coming right at my mouth. I moved, but not in time, and heard a crash inside the bridge of my nose. I felt my hips dip back, my legs and head come forward, and, curved like the letter C, I was swept 15 feet backward before I felt cold marble beneath the palms of my hands. Albie stepped around me and into the occupations room. Just then, I looked up to see Mr. Russo's black wing-tipped shoes enter the room. I'm almost sure he'd seen Albie blast me, but I'll never know. Nobody, including Albie and myself, ever mentioned it again. Perhaps it had been a mistake for me to call Albie a liar, but if he had starred at baseball, it was in some league I did not know. By way of contrast, I want to introduce Duke Scarpa, another ex-con who was with us that year. Neither Albie nor the Duke, incidentally, was a typical member of my high school community. Both lived at the other end of Newark, Down Neck, and they had reached us only after the Board of Education had tried Albie at 2 other schools and the Duke at 4. The board hoped finally, like Marx, that the higher culture would absorb the lower. Albie and Duke had no particular use for each other. Where Albie had made up his mind to go straight, one always felt that the Duke, in his oily quietness, his boneless grace, was planning a job. Yet, though affection never lived between them, Duke wandered after Albie and me, aware, I suspect, that if Albie despised him, it was because he was able to read his soul, and that such an associate was easier to abide than one who despises you because he does not know your soul at all. Where Albie was a hippopotamus, an ox, Duke was reptilian. Me? I don't know. It's easy to spot the animal in one's fellows. During lunch hour, the Duke and I used to spar with each other in the hall outside the cafeteria. He did not know a hook from a jab and disliked having his dark skin roughened or his hair mussed, but he so delighted in moving, bobbing, coiling, and uncoiling that I think he would have paid for the privilege of playing the serpent with me. He hypnotized me, the Duke. He pulled some slimy string inside me, where Albie Pelagudi sought and stretched a deeper and, I think, a nobler chord. But I make Albie sound like peaches and cream. Let me tell you what he and I did to Mr. Russo. Russo believed in his battery of tests as his immigrant parents, and Albie's, and maybe Albie himself, believed in papal infallibility. If the test said Albie was going to be a lawyer, then he was going to be a lawyer. As for Albie's past, it seemed only to increase Russo's devotion to the prophecy. He approached Albie with salvation in his eyes. In September, then, he gave Albie a biography to read, The Life of Oliver Wendell Holmes. During October, once a week, he had the poor fellow speak impromptu before the class. In November, he had him write a report on the Constitution, which I wrote. And then in December, the final indignity. He sent Albie and me, and 2 others who displayed a legal bent, to the Essex County Courthouse where we could see real lawyers in action. It was a cold, windy morning, and as we flicked our cigarettes at the Lincoln statue on the Courtyard Plaza and started up the long flight of white cement steps, Albie suddenly did an about-face and headed back across the plaza and out to Market Street. I called to him, but he shouted back that he'd seen it all before, and then he was not walking, but running towards the crowded downtown streets, pursued not by police, but by other days. It wasn't that he considered Russo an ass for having sent him to visit the courthouse. Albie respected teachers too much for that. Rather, I think he felt Russo had tried to rub his nose in it. No surprise, then, when the next day after gym, Albie announced his assault on the occupations teacher. It was the first crime he had planned since his decision to go straight back in September. He outlined the action to me and indicated that I should pass the details on to the other members of the class. As liaison between Albie and the well-behaved, healthy non-convicts like myself who made up the rest of the class, I was stationed at the classroom door, and as each member passed in, I unfolded the plot into his ear. As soon after 10:15, as Russo turns to the blackboard, you bend over to tie your shoelace. If a classmate looked back at me puzzled, I would motion to Pelagudi hulking over his desk. The puzzled expression would vanish and another accomplice would enter the room. The only one who gave me any trouble was the Duke. He listened to the plan and then scowled back at me with the look of a man who's got his own syndicate and, in fact, has never even heard of yours. Finally, the bell rang. I closed the door behind me and moved noiselessly to my desk. I waited for the clock to move to 1/4 after. It did. And then Russo turned to the board to write upon it the salary range of aluminum workers. I bent to tie my shoelaces. Beneath all the desks, I saw other upside-down, grinning faces. To my left, behind me, I heard Albie hissing. His hands fumbled about his black silk socks, and the hiss grew and grew until it was a rush of Sicilian, muttered, spewed, vicious. The exchange was strictly between Russo and himself. I looked to the front of the classroom, my fingers knotting and unknotting my shoelaces, the blood pumping now to my face. I saw Russo's legs turn. What a sight he must have seen. Where there had been 25 faces, now there was nothing. Just desks. "Okay," I heard Russo say. "Okay." And then he gave a little clap with his hands. "That's enough now, fellas. The joke is over. Sit up." And then Albie's hiss traveled to all the blood-pinked ears below the desks. It rushed about us like a subterranean stream. "Stay down." While Russo asked us to get up, we stayed down. And we did not sit up until Albie told us to. And then, under his direction, we were singing. "Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Oh, no, no, don't sit under the apple tree." And then, in time to the music, we clapped. What a noise! Mr. Russo stood motionless at the front of the class, listening, astonished. He wore a neatly pressed dark blue pinstriped suit, a tan tie with a collie's head in the center, and a tie clasp with the initials RR engraved upon it. He had on the black wing-tipped shoes. They glittered. Russo, who believed in neatness, honesty, punctuality, planned destinies, who believed in the future, in occupations. And next to me, behind me, inside me, all over me, Albie. We looked at each other, Albie and I, and my lungs split with joy. "Don't sit under the apple tree." Albie's monotone boomed out, and then a thick, liquid crooner's voice behind Albie bathed me in sound. It was the Duke's. He clapped to a tango beat. Russo leaned for a moment against the visual aids chart. Skilled laborers, salaries and requirements. And then scraped back his chair and plunged down into it, so far down it looked to have no bottom. He lowered his big head to the desk, and his shoulders curled forward like the ends of wet paper. And that was when Albie pulled his coup. He stopped singing, "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree." We all stopped. Russo looked up at the silence, his eyes black and baggy, and he stared at our leader, Alberto Pellegutti. Slowly, Russo began to shake his head from side to side. This was no Capone. This was a Garibaldi. Russo waited. I waited. We all waited. Albie slowly rose and began to sing. "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed?" And we all stood and joined him. Tears sparkling on his long black lashes, Mr. Robert Russo dragged himself wearily up from his desk, beaten. And as the Pellegutti basso boomed disastrously behind me, I saw Russo's lips begin to move. "The bombs bursting in air gave proof." God, did we sing. Albie left school in June of that year. He had passed only occupations. But our comradeship, that strange vessel, was smashed to bits at noon one day, a few months earlier. It was a lunch hour in March. The Duke and I were sparring in the hall outside the cafeteria, and Albie, who had been more hospitable to the Duke since the day his warm, liquid voice had joined the others, Albie had decided to act as our referee, jumping between us, separating our clinches, warning us about low blows, grabbing out for the Duke's droopy crotch, in general having a good time. I remember that the Duke and I were in a clinch, As I showered soft little punches to his kidneys, he squirmed in my embrace. The sun shone through the window behind him, lighting up his hair like a nest of snakes. I fluttered his sides, he twisted. I breathed hard through my nose. My eyes registered on his snaky hair. And suddenly, Albie wedged between and knocked us apart. The Duke plunged sideways, I plunged forward, and my fist crashed through the window that Scarpa had been using as his corner. Feet pounded. In a second, a wisecracking, guiltless, chewing crowd was gathered around me. Just me. Albie and the Duke were gone. I cursed them both, the honorless bastards. The crowd did not drift back to lunch until the head dietitian, a huge, varicose-veined matron in a laundry-stiff white uniform, had written down my name and led me to the nurse's office to have the glass picked out of my knuckles. Later in the afternoon, I was called for the first and only time to the office of Mr. Wendell, the principal. 15 years have passed since then, and I do not know what has happened to Albie Pellegudi. If he is a gangster, he was not one with notoriety or money enough for the Kefauver Committee to interest itself in several years ago. When the crime committee reached New Jersey, I followed their investigations carefully, but never did I read in the papers the name Alberto Pellegudi or even Duke Scarpa, though who can tell what name the Duke is known by now? I do know, however, what happened to the occupations teacher. For when another Senate committee swooped through the state a while back, it was discovered that Robert Russo, among others, had been a Marxist while attending Montclair State Teachers College, circa 1935. Russo refused to answer some of the committee's questions, and the Newark Board of Education met, chastised, and dismissed him. I read now and then in the Newark News that Civil Liberties Union attorneys are still trying to appeal his case. And I have even written a letter to the Board of Education swearing that if anything subversive was ever done to my character, it wasn't done by my ex-high school teacher, Russo. If he was a communist, I never knew it. I could not decide whether or not to include in the letter a report of the Star-Spangled Banner incident. Who knows what is and is not proof to the crotchety ladies and chain store owners who sit and die on boards of education? And if, to alter an ancient's text, a man's history is his fate, who knows whether the Newark Board of Education will ever attend to a letter written to them by me? I mean, have 15 years buried that afternoon I was called to see the principal? He was a tall, distinguished gentleman, and as I entered his office, he rose and extended his hand. The same sun that an hour earlier had lit up snakes in the Duke's hair now slanted through Mr. Wendell's blinds and warmed his deep green carpet. "How do you do?" he said. "Yes," I answered non-sequiturely, and ducked my bandaged hand under my unbandaged hand. Graciously, he said, "Sit down, won't you?" Frightened, unpracticed, I performed an aborted curtsy and sat. I watched Mr. Wendell go to his metal filing cabinet, slide one drawer open, and take from it a large white index card. He set the card on his desk and motioned me over so I might read what was typed on the card. At the top, in caps, was my whole name, last, first, and middle. Below the name was a Roman numeral 1, and beside it, "Fighting in Corridor, Broke Window, 3/1942, already documented, and on a big card with plenty of space. I returned to my chair and sat back as Mr. Wendell told me that the card would follow me through life. At first I listened, but as he talked on and on, the drama went out of what he said, and my attention wandered to his filing cabinet. I began to imagine the cards inside, Albie's card and the Duke's, and then I understood, just short of forgiveness, why the two of them had zoomed off and left me to pay penance for the window by myself. Albie, you see, had always known about the filing cabinet and these index cards. I hadn't. And Russo, poor Russo has only recently found out.